When these huge global trade deals get signed, it's all happening in fancy boardrooms, right? But the real impact, that's felt out in the fields. Today, we're going to unpack a really important story about promises and consequences, how the World Trade Organization's grand plan to fix global farming collided head-on with the lives of hundreds of millions of Indian farmers. And to really get what's going on, you have to start here with this simple but incredibly profound truth from Mahatma Gandhi. For centuries, the absolute heart and soul of India has been its rural, agricultural life. We're not just talking about an industry. For so many, it's a total way of life. And look, this isn't some old, dusty, historical idea. This number right here shows you the reality today. 56%. More than half of India's entire population. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of millions of people still depend on agriculture for their livelihood. Their lives are directly tied to the land. All right, so here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with the state of Indian agriculture, then introduce the WTO's big idea, break down the nitty-gritty of its rules, see how they kind of created an unfair situation, and finally look at the very real human impact of it all. Okay, let's jump right in. To really set the stage, we need to ask, what does farming even look like in a nation of over 1 billion people? So right away, we run into this really interesting paradox. If you look at the economics, agriculture's slice of the GDP pie has gotten way, way smaller since the 1950s. But, and this is the key, in human terms, it is still the absolute bedrock of the society. And that disconnect is so crucial for understanding all the tensions that come next. So into this whole situation steps a major new player on the world stage, the World Trade Organization. And it showed up with a huge promise. A promise to create a more open and more fair system for everybody, especially in the world of farming. And the centerpiece of their whole plan was something called the Agreement on Agriculture, or AOA. Now, on paper, this thing sounded great. The goals were really admirable, to create a perfectly level playing field, where farm goods could be traded fairly, and it would benefit everyone, from producers to consumers all across the world. Basically, the AOA was built on 3 big ideas. First was market access. That meant countries needed to lower their import barriers to let more stuff in. Second, export competition. This was about stopping countries from just dumping super cheap, subsidized products on the world market. And third, the one that got really complicated, domestic support, which created a whole new set of rules for how governments could help their own farmers. So let's zoom in on that third pillar. Domestic support, because this right here is where things start to get, well, pretty tricky and super controversial. It all came down to this system they called the subsidy boxes. Okay, before we get into the colors and all that, let's just be clear about what we're talking about. Domestic support. It's just the official WTO jargon for farm subsidies. We're talking about everything from guaranteeing a certain price for crops to giving farmers money for fertilizer, electricity, and water. So what the WTO did was create this whole color-coded system to sort out these subsidies. First, you had the amber box. This was for subsidies that directly messed with trade, and the idea was to reduce these. Then you had the green box for support that was considered okay, stuff like funding for research or food security programs. Those were allowed. And finally, the blue box was kind of a middle ground for subsidies that were still linked to production but had some limits on them. Okay, so you've got this system of rules. Sounds organized, right? But how those rules actually get applied, that's a whole different story. This is the moment where that promise of a level playing field starts to look, well, pretty lopsided. And this is the absolute kicker, hidden right in the fine print. The rules demanded that developing nations had to slash their most important subsidies by 20% and do it in just 6 years. Meanwhile, the developed nations, they were given 10 years to make a much smaller cut of 13%. The pressure was on, all right, but it was not applied equally at all. I mean, just look at this. This number is absolutely staggering. It shows you the insane gap we're dealing with. These rules were being applied to a world where, back in 1995, the average U.S. farmer got $29,000 just in subsidies. That's almost 100 times the entire annual income of a corn farmer in the Philippines at that time. The starting lines weren't just different, they were in completely different universes. And if you think that was just how things started, take a look at this. This is data from a decade after the rules were in place. And what does it show? It shows that despite all the rules, developed countries like the US and those in the EU were still pouring massive amounts of money into those supposedly bad trade-distorting amber box subsidies. They figured out how to work the system to their advantage, keeping up huge levels of support that farmers in developing countries just couldn't possibly compete with. So that brings us to our last, and honestly, our most important section. What did all of this, the rules, the boxes, the imbalances, what did it all actually mean for the farmer on the ground in India? What happened in the years right after this agreement is, well, it's a pretty intense sequence of events. In 1997, a tragic wave of farmer suicides begins. Just a year later, major policy changes open up India's previously protected seed sector to huge global corporations. And then, a few years after that, brand new, very expensive, genetically modified seeds like BT cotton are introduced with these incredible promises of huge profits for farmers. A new kind of seed, a promise of wealth. So, what happened? Did this new globalized world deliver on its promise? Well, it wasn't good. In fact, it was a disaster. The source material estimates that farmers in just 2 states lost a staggering 1 billion rupees because that miracle BT cotton crop failed. Instead of getting rich, many farmers found themselves buried in even more debt. And while all of this is going on, there's another really important piece of the puzzle. What was the government itself doing? This chart shows a pretty stark comparison. The Chinese government invests way more in its agricultural sector than India does, even though a much smaller part of its population actually depends on farming. It just goes to show how internal policy choices, when you combine them with these external pressures, can make the challenges for farmers even tougher. So when you put it all together, it really leaves you with this one big, tough question. When the starting lines are so incredibly different and the rules of the game can be twisted and bent, can a global trading system ever create a truly level playing field for the small farmer? That's the challenge that's still right at the heart of this entire story.